Hi everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Eternal Flame News. I'm Miranda.
I'm Jeremy Caverly.
And we are JMC Ministries. The topic for tonight is a really hard one to discuss, and we were going to briefly talk about this topic on our JMC live show this following Monday. But this we have gotten so much information about this topic, and we felt it really needed its own show and complete attention instead of trying to just briefly talk about it because there's just so much going on. And the topic is the former abortion doctor from Indiana who died back in September, a month ago, and they have found now over 2,300 dead babies on his property in Illinois, and then also in his car. They found 2,246 dead babies in a garage of this abortion doctor. And then just a week or so ago, the authorities now have found 165 more dead baby bodies that he had stored in his Mercedes-Benz car. And so this just baffles us that the mainstream media is not digging into the history of this doctor. And really, I mean, they're reporting, well, this, these babies were found, and that's about all we're going to talk about that. They're not doing an in-depth investigation on this or anything. And we know why, because it deals with abortion. But we are not the mainstream media. We're not really anybody, but we felt that this is something we need to share with our friends and family and people who follow our ministry. And the main reason we feel that we should be talking about this is because back on January 17th of this year, God gave me a vision about abortion. And I'm going to read this to you. We did a whole show about this vision and about the pro-abortion laws that were in the process of being passed. This is back in January, and fast forward now, we're at October 19th. There has been so much pro-abortion legislation passed or trying to be passed, and we want to share this all over again, and also talk, and we feel like we need to share with you about this abortion doctor, because clearly there are others out there like him. Because back in 2013, Kermit Gosnell, the former abortion doctor Kermit Gosnell from Pittsburgh, is it Pittsburgh? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pittsburgh. He went on trial, and him and this abortion doctor from Indiana are almost identical twins. Kermit Gosnell, he performed illegal abortions, did all kinds of illegal stuff at his abortion clinics, got shut down. They went and investigated, and they found that he kept babies in freezers and body parts in jars and preserved them. And this abortion doctor that we're reading about now in the headlines just in the past few weeks, he does the same thing. But yet, I think if he was alive, we would be hearing a lot more, and he would probably be arrested and stuff. But he's dead. And but I'm sure since, the Kermit Gosnell thing happened, and now the Dr. Cloffer, that was his name, Dr. Cloffer, happens. Clearly, this is not just, it wasn't an isolated thing with Kermit Gosnell. Mm-hmm. And clearly, there is very, very demonic things afoot in the darkness that needs to be brought to light. So, without further ado, we're going to begin the show, and sit back, and I would say not to be eating or drinking anything if you're watching this, because it does get pretty graphic at times, and but this is truth. We're going to share every article, news article. We'll put links to everything so you can see the documentation of all of this, and prove to you that this is not fake news. This is not. This is really happening in America, and I'm sure other places around the world. So we're going to start with the vision that God gave me back on January 7th, 2019.
And please be praying for us as we do this.
Yes, please pray for us, because when we did the show back in January, was it February? I can't remember. I think it was February. We did a show on the abortion. We got attacked pretty bad. So, yes, be praying for us. I entitled this, A Vision from God, The Path of Man's Destruction is Paved with the Bodies of the Innocent. This vision I share now is only because the Lord has told me to, and not in the pursuit of money, wealth, fame, or recognition, but to share God's truth and hope that one day someone will read these things and repent and be saved through the blood of Jesus Christ. The week of January 7th, 2019, I went to sleep and found myself along a dirt road that was on the outskirts of a big city. There were dozens of people standing along this road, and it was very hot, and the dust from the road kept blowing into my face. I looked down the road to the right of me and saw a bridge, like that of an overpass that cars drive on, and just beyond the bridge, I saw a giant machine. It was unlike any machine I have ever seen in my life, and it's very hard to describe. It was an enormous machine that stood as tall as a 2- or 3-story building. It had giant wheels that stood 2 or 3 stories tall as well. On each wheel there were giant spikes. There were 8 of these giant wheels on this machine, 4 in the front and 4 in the back. And on each spike, on each wheel, there was the body of a baby that had been speared through the head. When I saw this, I began crying uncontrollably. As the giant machine rolled down the road, each time the wheels met the ground, the babies' bodies were ground into the road and buried. I could not bear to look at this and turned my head away. I then looked towards the people standing along the road, watching this scene. Some people were standing there with no emotion at all, while others, mostly women, were screaming and weeping uncontrollably and falling on their knees along the road. I realized these women and men who were screaming and weeping were doing so because their babies were on that machine. As the machine came closer to me, the wind blew and the smell of death filled the air, and I felt sick smelling the dead bodies of the babies. It was then that I heard an angel speak and say, "The path of man's destruction is paved with the bodies of the innocent." This machine is the demon of abortion that seeks to kill the innocent of the world. I then heard the angel speak to me again, and he said, "It would be better a millstone be wrapped around their necks, and they be thrown into the sea, than to harm one of these little ones." It was the Bible scripture from Matthew chapter 18, verse 6, the words that Jesus spoke. After the angel said this to me, I saw a woman standing near me. I approached her and asked, "Why are all the babies speared through the head?" The woman, with no emotion on her face, replied, "Oh, they do that because that is the fastest way to kill them, and they don't cry for very long." I was horrified when I heard this woman say this to me, as if it was a normal conversation, like talking about the weather. The other thing I noticed about the babies was that they were all different ages. There was also no blood coming out of them, as if all the blood had been previously drained from their bodies, and this confused me. It was at this point that I realized I was not awake, and I suddenly woke up. I was nauseated, and my head was spinning from what I had seen in the vision. Now, I must tell you that I have never in my life studied or watched videos about abortion, or the techniques used to kill a baby in the womb, partially born or killed right after it is born. I have always prayed against the killing of babies being aborted, and have my entire life spoke out against the killing of babies, but never exposed myself visually to what abortion looks like. I know without a doubt that this was a true vision from God. I cried to God and prayed, wanting to understand why. Why was I shown this vision now? My answer came just 2 weeks later on January 22nd, 2019. On January 22nd, 2019, New York State signed into law the most radical abortion law ever passed in U.S. history. The law states that a woman can kill her baby all the way to her due date for any reason that she chooses. The videos that the news is posting show men and women cheering as the governor of New York signs the law. They also announced that the Freedom Towers in New York City will be lit up the color pink at night for all to see in celebration of this new law. When I saw this on the news, I realized why the babies in my vision had no blood coming out of them when they were speared on the machine. It was because their blood is on the hands of the men and women who passed these laws and performed these killings of the babies. After this abortion bill was passed in New York State today, January 30th, 2019, it was announced on the news that a Democrat woman from Virginia wanted to create an abortion bill to pass into law that is even more radical than the one passed in New York. I tell you that there is a wave of evil coming to the United States and the world if Christians do not become bold and courageous and stand up for the unborn children as well as the born children in the world. We must remember, in history, Satan used many to order the killing of innocent babies and children to try and stop the will of God. Pharaoh ordered the killing of Jewish babies in Egypt to try and kill Moses. Herod ordered the killings of babies in Bethlehem to kill Jesus. Hitler ordered the killings of Jewish babies and children. The demon slaughtering the innocent is a giant that seems to keep growing century after century because of the evil that has grown within the hearts of man. As more countries pass laws to allow the killing of those inside the womb and outside the womb, we see an increase of not just abortion laws passing, but also euthanasia laws passing through government, not just in the U.S., but across the world. As Christians, we cannot stop at just speaking out and working to protect the unborn. We must also continue speaking out and protecting children and the innocent once they are born. So many children in need of loving homes, so many women who have chosen not to abort their babies and keep them need support after their babies are born. But I also want to add, that I didn't add in my post here, that we also need to help the women who have had abortions, who are repentant and who are suffering because they made that choice and are suffering with the guilt and the shame that they killed and they murdered their babies. We need to support them as well. You reading this or watching this right now, I am sure wondering, what can I do? I will tell you what God told me to do. Number 1, pray intercessory prayer for the unborn babies in this world, that God protect them. Number 2, pray intercessory prayer for the women and men considering killing their unborn baby and also born babies and children, that God open their eyes and help them realize they do not need to kill their child or children. Number 3, pray intercessory prayer for the doctors and nurses that are performing these murders, that God change their heart and open their eyes to what they are really doing and they stop murdering unborn babies. Number 4, Boldly speak out against abortion and also euthanasia. Take a stand, but not in hate, but in love. Without violence and without malice. Number 5, when it comes time to vote, forget about political parties and vote as God would lead you. I know if we do not take a stand against the killing of innocent children around the world, God will surely shorten our days, as Jesus says in the book of Matthew. Now, what has happened since my vision? Well, as I just said before starting the show, we talked about the abortion doctor in Indiana, but we also want to, since I posted this back on January 30th, New York has passed new pro-abortion laws, but many other states have as well. And just this week, California became the latest state to pass a new pro-abortion bill. They have now passed a bill to mandate all public colleges in the state of California to provide the abortion pill to all students that come and ask for it. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. But we're going to now turn this over to Jeremy, because that's a lot of reading, and we're going to let him read. He's going to read to you the articles that we found about this doctor that have recently been in the news. And then we're going to, after that, then talk about this documentary film that Mark and Amy Archer have been making over the past year about this doctor before he died, and about how Indiana shut down his abortion clinics and took his license away. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy.
Hello everybody, and the time that Miranda has read this story, I have 4 articles in front of me. I've actually found 9 more involving the topic of abortion that has happened in the last 7 days. From Friar Frank Pavone talking about Mayor Pete saying this topic, this story here, it's not that, it shouldn't stop abortion. It's disturbing. He thinks the guy's a bad guy, but he thinks, because this is on LifeSite News, oh, this is fine. Not a problem. And there are several other stories. And it's not just LifeSite News. It's in the Catholic Church. You can find it in the Methodist Church, in the Baptist Church, and all sorts of different places have been talking about this topic of abortion for years. But not since Gosnell has something been so horrific as this. So, I have these 4 that I'm going to read. I just threw that one in there because there's going to be more to this after this show, when this documentary finally gets done next year. And between now and the time of next year, there'll be even more things that will be revealed. Even Abby Johnson's hinting on some things on her page as well that are coming down the pipe. So this is a topic that you need to be informed of, and it is difficult to absorb. So we will be posting the links to all of these stories that you can find. And this one is more than 2,000 fetal remains found at the home of the state's most prolific abortion doctor by Marissa It. This was September 14th.
This is the original.
This is the original story.
When it broke.
When it broke. So this is, you know, we're going back a month. And I'm not going to read verbatim everything, but I'm going to give you the big pieces of each paragraph. So this is more than 2,000 medically preserved fetal remains. So let's pause on this for a second. What does that mean? So, any of you who have been in science class, did you ever have to dissect a frog or a cow eye? What did it come in? It came in a glass jar, right, with some liquid. So that's what we're talking about. This guy had preserved, like mummified, like, you know, the recent article that just came out. They found all these preserved, you know, carcasses in these coffins, you know, in the Egyptian area. This same thing, but this just happened now, of babies. We're not talking about historically. We're not talking about some other country. We're talking about here in America. Someone's got 2,000 body parts complete baby in a container of liquid to preserve for scientific experiments. This sounds like something out of a Frankenstein movie, man. I'm telling you what. So listen to this. Found in his home in Illinois by his family. It said lawyer for Earl George Koffler's family called the Will County Coroner's Office that afternoon, and they said to the sheriff, he died on September 3rd, and he worked for decades at the Women's Pavilion Clinic in South Bend, Indiana, and clinics in Gary and Fort Wayne, Indiana. So when they went to the home, they found 2,246 fetal remains. We're not talking about 2,000 different various parts. Most of these we're talking about complete babies. And the coroner's office took this. He's considered the most prolific abortion doctor with tens of thousands of procedures performed legally. The South Bend Tribune reported. The state suspended, or some people use the word revoked or taken away, his license in 2016 for failing to exercise reasonable care and violating notice and documentation requirements, the Tribune reported. The Women's Pavilion shut down the same year. It says in Indiana, fetal remains must be buried or cremated. Representative Jackie Kowarski, Representative Republican, Indiana said, and proposing federal legislation that the disposal of aborted fetus remains. So they want to have a full investigation into him. Jeannie Mancini, president of the Anti-Abortion March for Life, said that fetal remains allegedly at his home are a reminder it's outrageous that abortion activists and many politicians advocate for fewer regulations on procedure. Some people have argued just this point, said, well, maybe he didn't have the money to bury all the babies. Then why weren't they in the facility? Why did he take them home? See, there, you got to think about this for a second. If you took your funding away and you had baby parts in the facility, wouldn't you think you would try and get them to another facility? I'm just going to take them home. You know, what is he going to do? Fry him up with some Spam? What was he doing? I mean, come on. So to quote Jeannie Mancini, says, we urge a thorough investigation in this case so justice may be done so that the public becomes aware of what really happens inside the American abortion industry. This is echoes of the Kermit Gosnell case in Philadelphia. 2013, convicted him of murder for snipping spinal cords of 3 babies who lived moments outside of the womb. And there they found dismembered remains in milk jugs and glass jars inside his clinic. But now back to the remains of Kloffler's home, his clinic location near South Bend, whose mayor is a Democrat president candidate, Pete
Buttigieg. So
says, you know, he thinks, like it says right here in Lifesite News, I got it pulled up on my phone, I'm not going to play the video, but he says it's extremely disturbing, but, you know, we shouldn't stop the abortion process because of one bad guy.
And that man is running for president, people.
So he's all like, that. He's just a blink of an eye of like, no big deal, you know, let's just, you know.
So that was September 14th. Let's fast forward a few days.
Yeah, so now this is September 20th. Now the investigation is going on. Now the headline says thousands of patient records found at Indiana abortion clinics run by doctor who hoarded remains at home. Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill expressed concern at the enormous amount of records that are improperly kept at the 3 clinics. Quote, he certainly was problematic in life and as it turns out continues to present problems in his death. Quote, one of the most notorious abortionists in history of Indiana who had a record of deplorable conditions of violations of regulatory controls. Quote, the discarding or abandonment of confidential records and appropriateness of that process. Again, they mentioned about him being suspended in 2016. Hill said that a 10-year-old patient of Kloffler was raped by her uncle and the doctor failed to adequately document the abortion. They're investigating that too, along with the remains at his home, and uncover the records to help find who the child rapist is. Now it's, quote, high degree of expectation of privacy and confidentiality. Part of the responsibility of the Attorney General's office is to secure, abandon, or discard medical records to ensure the confidentiality of those offers are maintained. So there's two directions going here. This guy didn't properly keep documents right.
He did nothing properly.
He was a hoarder. So I guess, just like regular hoarders that keep all sorts of stuff, like you get rid of a sink and you still want to keep it, or you had your stinky baby doll when you were like 2 that you vomited and crapped all over and you keep it. If you're an abortion doctor, you're going to keep that. So if anyone else becomes a hoarder or something like that.
Okay, let's stop there. Because most hoarders don't hoard dead babies. That is what serial killers do. Serial killers hoard, like, let's do the co-ed killer from back in the 70s.
And that's the bit where this quote.
He cut their heads off and buried them under on his mother's property, under her windowsill.
We checked a couple of different areas that may be appropriate or places where remains may have been buried. So there's an underlying thing. They're thinking, well, if there's remains in the house, could he bury them in his backyard? Could they be somewhere else?
He acts like a serial killer. This. If you read on true crime, criminology, the history of murder, this is what serial killers do.
Yep, and he says
and people are literally making excuses why it's okay for him to have done this to these babies' bodies, and it is sickening. Did you finish that article?
Yeah, I'm just not going to read the last snippet. But like I said, I'm
so
looking at...
he not only has... Okay, so far, now we are rewinding time. We're going back in time. So at this point, all we know is of the 2,246 dead baby bodies that he has kept in his garage and his home in Illinois. Then, now they've discovered on September... That was September 14th when that... Now we're at September 20th, where they've discovered he's got all these medical records that he has not taken care of properly, and people's information could be stolen or exposed, all kinds of craziness. Okay, so then let's go to October. What's the date on that one?
This is October 11th.
October 11th.
And like I said, I'm scrolling through my phone through this.
No, let's just read.
Because there's more things besides what we wanted to put in here. So I'm trying to put snippets of other things
this is the main thing we're focusing on.
But this is the main juicy stuff. There's more stuff coming after we're done by other people, by the way. So this is Indiana AG. 165 more fetal remains linked to the late doctor. Wait a minute. That brings the now number to what, Miranda?
Over 2,300 dead babies this man has hoarded in a home and now in his Mercedes Benz. Oh, huh?
Wait, you slow down. You're going too fast. More than 2,400 at this point.
Okay.
So she just spilled the beans. Now they found them in the trunk of the Mercedes Benz at a business property
that he owned.
He had 8 cars. But they're thinking they've been in these cars or somewhere else, and the abortions look like they were committed in 2002. But they're cleaning out different places and they're finding different things.
Just read it.
So, from 2000 to 2002, his clinics Fort Wayne, Gary, South Bend. The Fort Wayne closed in 2014, Gary and South Bend the next year. So that brings it to 2,411. Now, Curtis Hill, Attorney General, says, uncharted territory for all of us, and wants to receive a respectable final distribution here in Indiana. We are following the same protocol for these additional 165 remains that have already been established. Now, Kevin Bolger, Chicago's attorney, said the families got no comment, and they're very shocked. And they didn't know it was there. And they probably wouldn't have. Like Miranda said earlier, criminals, specifically
serial killers,
or murderers and rapists and other things like that, they either stalk and target people, and because in the event of this whole abortion scenario, there's a dialogue with the women and the people that go to the facility to convince them to do this.
Well, let me also tell you, if you read about serial killers, they're very convincing. They know how to get people to do what they want. Or a lot of times when we read about spouses of serial killers, they didn't know anything. They kind of had a suspicion, but but in this case, I mean, the guy was killing babies. So
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, he was flat out going to work every day killing babies.
Yeah,
so in my opinion, I don't know. Maybe it really isn't a shock to his family. Who knows the truth? Only they know the truth, and they're not talking. But I cannot imagine. But you will find out. People had their suspicions about this doctor. Mm-hmm. The people in the pro-life community.
Yep. So the article finishes.
They felt that he was.
That Hill's going to work with the Democrat Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul to investigate what's going on, and they still don't know the exact number of medical records found. Hasn't been disclosed, so there's still one other thing. But they're
not talking about this anymore in the.
But my thought is here on this whole situation. While we're focusing on, we've talked about Gaza, we're talking about this guy. I am 100% confident in saying this next phrase. There's somebody else doing something very similar.
Oh, I have no doubt in my mind.
Maybe not hiding baby. I mean, of course, it might be more, towards mental illness specifically, not an actual abortion doctor. Maybe it's some kind of weird religious ritual somewhere and something like that.
I'm not going that far. Let's just stay focused on
the point of the matter is that this is why clinics and things are shutting down and rules and regulations are changing.
And I do believe
he should have been removed a lot sooner.
Oh yeah, years and years ago. Oh, years. But they don't want the pro-choice community doesn't want abortion clinics to be susceptible to regulations like hospitals or maternity wards or doctor's offices. I mean, they want it to be so easy just to go in and do whatever you want, without any kind of repercussions.
Yeah.
And sadly, women die. Mm-hmm. Women have died. That was one of the reasons Kermit Gosnell was sentenced to life, because women did die.
Yeah.
Under his care. And when we get into this documentary that Mark and Amber Archer have been doing about Dr. Coffer, it just gets darker and darker. And
all right.
So
we're gonna go to my fourth article.
No, that's at the end.
We're at the end. We're gonna save mine for last.
Okay, so what you see on the screen right now, this is from Wikipedia, and this is the stats of how many people died in the September 11th attacks. Okay, so we know now that this Dr. Coffer in Indiana, he kept over 2,400 dead babies on his properties. I want you to understand how many bodies that is. On September 11, 2001, 2,977 people died in total. I want you to understand, Dr. Coffer hoarded just under, like 500, right around 500 less dead bodies than all the people that died on September 11th. I want you to think about that. If this man would have killed over 2,400 regular people, as we look at them, he would be sentenced to probably the death penalty. But because he killed and hoarded over 2,400 dead babies that were aborted in his clinics. You're not really hearing much about that, are you? And that's the problem. That is the problem. They want to hide the horrors that they are committing in these clinics. But there is a couple that is bringing to light these horrors. And their names are Mark and Amber Archer. They've been in the process over the past year to make the documentary Inwood Drive. Inwood Drive is the name of the road that Dr. Coffer's abortion clinic was in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The reason I know about this couple and their documentary is because of the Glenn Beck radio show. I have not seen these people be interviewed on any Fox News, CNN, anywhere. ABC, NBC. They're not asking them. But here's what their documentary is about. The film. For Mark and Amber Archer comes a film that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Inwood Drive brings you an up-close and personal account of the abortion battle that ensued on one city street in Indiana's second largest city. This husband and wife filmmaking team dared to ask how their city became known as the second largest abortion desert in the nation. This documentary film examines the controversy of the issues surrounding abortion. You'll glean insight from a variety of perspectives, even the abortionist himself, Ulrich George Klopfer. Inwood Drive is the most informative movie you'll see on the most controversial civil rights issue of our time. No matter your stance, you'll gain a newfound understanding of right to life organizations, duties of elected officials, and the actions of concerned citizens who care about the protection of women and life. Here's an update on their production since all this news has come out about Dr. Klopfer since he died. After completing what we thought was the finished film in July 2019, there is more to the story, and we've reopened production to ensure the whole story is told. Over 2,200 preserved fetuses were found in Dr. Klopfer's home after he died early September 2019. Additional remains were found October 9th at a storage facility near Chicago, bringing the total thus far to 2,411 aborted children. This story has become national and internationally known. We will continue documenting and bring light to this awful practice and horrific findings. So that's where they're at with their documentary. But if you go to their website, markarcherfilms.com, you'll scroll down and it says, read the interview with the abortionist, and it will take you to their blog. They created a 4-part blog series while they were doing this, making this documentary. They shared the parts of the interview with Dr. Klopfer. And we're going to read some of this to you, because these people let Dr. Klopfer tell his story, and friends, family, fellow brothers and sisters of Christ, what we're about to read you, will feel like you are in the presence of Dr. Mengele, the doctor at Auschwitz who killed and did experiments on children during World War II. Is how I felt listening to this interview, reading it. That this Dr. Klopfer is just a reincarnation of Dr. Mengele, in my opinion. So, without further ado, let's move on to interview with the abortionist. From Mark and Amy Archer, or I don't know why I keep saying Amy, Amber Archer. They posted this on February, the first part on February 1st, 2019. They write, before I had taken my 3-year sabbatical from film production, Amber and I had gone down one morning to stand with the protesters and sidewalk counselors outside the abortion clinic on Inwood Drive on a procedure day. Now, I'm going to stop there. I want you to go back to my vision that God gave me on January 7th, 2019. Okay, I was standing along a road in a big city, and there were people lined down the road as this machine comes through. People were crying. People were looking indifferent. Different types of people with different types of feeling were standing watching this vision. What I'm about to read you is almost exactly like my vision. So they, Mark and Amber went down to stand with the protesters and sidewalk counselors outside the abortion clinic on Inwood Drive on a procedure day in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Standing there with our then newborn oldest daughter, Elizabeth, watching women pull into the parking lot and walk into the clinic to pay abortionist George Cloffer to dismember and murder their babies, I was struck by the surreal setting of a modern-day Auschwitz. On one side of the street, a modern-day Auschwitz on one side of the street and a gospel-preaching Baptist church on the other. The width of a city street was literally the only thing separating the living from the dead and the condemned. During World War II, the condemned were brought in by trains and unloaded into the gas execution chambers at gunpoint. Today, the condemned are brought in by car, safely inside their mother's wombs and protected by law for the sole purpose of their execution. This is a movie, I remember thinking to myself that very day, and it would be called Inwood Drive. Good versus evil, separated only by the width of a city street. And with that trip back in the spring of 2010, the script was written, and I would be, and it would be another 8 years, however, before that story, filed away in my mental file cabinet, would be revived and put into production as Amber and I were preparing ourselves for the imminent arrival of our third daughter, Caitlin. I don't doubt that babies on the brain contributed to our decision to put Inwood Drive into development in July of 2018. But for certain, we did it because we knew the Lord was directing us to do it. Of all of the film projects I've ever done in 30 plus years of a career in filmmaking, I've never been more sure of any film in my life. Now this day, I found myself staring once again at the phone, contemplating placing the phone call to George Cloffer, the infamous abortionist himself, to offer him the opportunity to be interviewed for a feature film all about him and his eventual downfall, trying to put aside my feelings towards a man I had never met, but knowing full well what he had made a career of for over as long as I have been alive. I closed my eyes and asked the Lord for strength. Help me do this, Lord. I know you didn't bring me this far for me to sit on my hands, Mark says. So Mark picks up the phone and he calls. But Dr. Cloffer doesn't answer. And he's kind of happy about that. And so he leaves a message and then he hangs up the phone. But as soon as he hangs up the phone, after leaving the message, the phone rings. And Mark says, I swallowed hard as I took a deep breath and launched into my producer mode. Dr. Cloffer answers, and Mark tells him who he is, and he says, yeah, Dr. Cloffer, how are you? My name is Mark Archer. I'm a film producer. I'm working on a feature film, documentary film, about you and your abortion business and your battle in Fort Wayne and across the state of Indiana. I wondered if I might ask you some questions. To Mark's total shock, George was one of the more pleasant people he had talked to in such a setting, especially considering the fact that Mark was telling him flat out that he was making a movie about about George's demise as an abortionist. Mark says, I never expected him to call me back, let alone have a pleasant conversation with me about it. After a few minutes of conversation, I asked him if I could sit down with him and talk in more detail, because I really was interested in getting his side of the story and letting him speak on his own behalf. George agreed, and we set a time for just a few days away to go to his now shut down clinic in Fort Wayne to have a sit-down conversation with him. So the interview is set for them to go to Inwood Drive and meet at George's shut-down abortion clinic. So Mark goes on, he says, my goal going in to talk to George was simple. What's done is done. I can't change the fact that this man has taken the lives of literally tens of thousands of babies. It's a documented fact. Whether I like it or not, as a filmmaker, it is my job to tell the truth and be objective about doing so. Of course, I have my opinion about what he's done. That's the whole reason I felt compelled to tell the story. But, as Mark says, George must answer to the Lord. Mark says, I must answer to the Lord for my being truthful in everything I put on screen. Being truthful means confirming your sources, and the best way to confirm a source about someone is to talk to that someone. I was determined to give George that chance, whether I felt like he deserved to be heard or not. I'm not going in to see if he can convince me of anything, I would tell the few individuals that we shared the news with before we met with George. I'm going to let him speak for himself. I'm not like him or what he's done. I may not like him or what he's done, but I'm not going to fabricate stories about him based on conjecture and hearsay. If I do that, I'm no better than Michael Moore or 95% of the media. Whatever my mind can imagine about his reasons for doing what he's done, I imagine it 10 times worse. And what a prophetic statement that would be. We never could have imagined, however, just how much sadness we would feel for a man like George Cloffer. We never could have imagined just how much our hearts would hurt for how lost and deceived he is, and how in need of Christ's forgiveness he truly is. As we prepared ourselves mentally and spiritually for our conversation in just a few days' time, we both could feel the darkness closing in all around us as we prayed fervently for the light of Christ to go before us. We were about to experience the very heart of darkness. And that is the end of the first of part 1 interview with the abortionist by Mark Archer. You can read this part 1 blog at markarcherfilms.com, as well as the other parts we're going to share bits of. So the interview is set. Mark and Amber are preparing to go basically into the lion's den and meet with George Cloffer and let him share his story. So let's go to part 2, interview with the abortionist. They posted this on March 4th, 2019. Mark Archer writes, we didn't tell very many people about our appointment to interview abortionist George Cloffer for our feature documentary film Inwood Drive, but the few people we did tell about it were universally shocked by it. Half were shocked that he had agreed to even talk with us. The other half were shocked that we were even giving him the time of day. I would have to say that, for my own part, I was in both camps. Transparency is difficult, especially in nonfiction storytelling. There's always a temptation to just fabricate the elements you're missing based on loosely gathered information and conjecture rather than actual first-hand accounts. Of course, you don't tell yourself you're fabricating things. You just you use creative language like filling in the blanks or, quote, taking some creative license. The problem is it's still inserting what you want to happen where something may or may not have happened. I hear people try to justify it all the time. Quote, how do you know it didn't happen that way? Simple. You don't know it happened that way or at all. You're making it up. That's called a lie. So, Mark is really not wanting to be like the mainstream media. He wants to get this right. And for good reason, because the main, if anything was fabricated as a Christian and as a pro-life, documentary film producer, they would eat him alive. The news and the progressive movement in our society. Mark goes on to say, you could say I have a unique perspective on the abortion issue since I was born in 1973. The same year, the U.S. Supreme Court made it legal to dismember me with surgical instruments and pull me out of my mother's womb in pieces. I was also born in the state of New York, the same state that just made it legal to kill babies like me even after we're born. To be going in to have a civil discourse with a man who has been murdering my generation since he could do it, and not be imprisoned, gave me a particular sort of creepiness that seemed to run up and down my spine for days. Mark continues and says, when we pulled up to the door, George's crashed up Mercedes sat out front. Now, this was 2018. Now, remember, they just found 165 dead babies in a Mercedes Benz that belonged to him. And when they pulled up to do this interview back in 2018, there was a Mercedes Benz parked in the parking lot. It does make you wonder, doesn't it, Jeremy? If that same Mercedes Benz is the one that they just found all those dead babies in. So, Mark and Amber pull up to the door to Inwood Drive abortion clinic. George Cloffer's crashed up Mercedes sat out front. Even though his practice at this particular location has been closed down since the end of 2013, George still owns the clinics he operated in Fort Wayne, South Bend, and Gary. As far as we could tell, the Fort Wayne clinic is the only one that he still visits weekly. Driving in on Wednesday night, sleeping in the clinic, and leaving again on Thursday morning. Thursdays used to be his, quote, procedure days. The fact that he still comes in and sleeps in a clinic that's been closed since the end of 2013 is nothing short of macabre. Sorry, I said it wrong. Macabre. Especially when you see the filth that surrounds it and indwells it. So they walk up to the door of the clinic. They knock on the door. No answer. They keep banging on the door. And finally, they see movement. And George comes to the door like he just woke up. And they tell him good morning. And said, asked him if he remembered they had a 9 o'clock appointment. And he looked, Mark says, he looked like he had literally just woken up as he acknowledged us and unlocked the door. I reached out my hand to shake his and introduce myself and Amber once more. Mark goes on to say, you want, that George says to him, you want to talk here or sit down at a table? With his thick German accent, he was surprisingly cordial to us. I could sense that he was a bit nervous with us. Individually, Amber and I have a tendency to do that to people. Together, intent on a mission and surrounded by prayer, we must have freaked him out. We weren't there to try to intimidate, but we were there for the truth, and neither of us was leaving that place until we got it. As we all sat down in what looked like the break room, Amber set her phone on the table and started the recorder. Mark says, you don't mind if we record this, do you? George just shrugged and said, no, it's fine. I explained the film premise to him once more, then looked at him and said, "So, tell me about yourself. How did you get to where you are now?" In the years leading up to this film, Mark says that he had heard what he thought were probably exaggerated stories about George and his coming out of Germany as a child. One of the harder to believe stories floating around about George was had him surviving an Allied bombing raid as a child in World War II and later swearing to kill as many American babies as he could as revenge for what he saw and endured. I had largely dismissed it as a biased conjecture passed on through the ranks of pro-life picketers through the years. So many stories like that are like urban myths, fabricated out of loosely gathered information, and they're nearly impossible to verify. You know you're hearing a red flag. A red flag story when it starts out with, quote, "I once heard that, but I had come in with an open mind to listen to his life story. I knew that no one had likely bothered to even listen to him tell his story, even those liberal media members through the years who covered up his crimes while they supported his practice. If there's one thing I know about people who have lived a life of notoriety, it's that they believe the world needs to hear what they have to say." There was a pause. I leaned back in my chair and looked at George. "I want to hear your story, George. When did you start down this career path?" Another pause as George looked at me over the top of his glasses. Then at Amber, he let out a long sigh. Never could we have imagined the sad and twisted life story that was about to unfold to us over the next hour. To my shock and horror, it all began for him at the age of 6, living in Dresden, Germany, living through the Allied firebombing raids of 1945. And that is the end of part 2 of Interview with the Abortionist by Mark and Amber Archer. And we will move on to part 3. And this is the actual interview. So, let's take a breath. And so you got to remember that they did this interview back in 2018. Guy was hoarding all these dead baby bodies, you know, all this stuff, doing all this stuff. Nobody knew. And there was Mark and Amber Archer sitting there talking to him, had no idea. But they felt this was one of the most important documentaries they were ever going to make. Before any of this ever came out, they had this feeling this was extremely important that they do this documentary about this guy. And boy, were they right. Weren't they, Jer? Okay, so
sure were.
Now we're going to move to part 3, Interview with the Abortionist. By Mark and Amber Archer. They posted this on March 11th, 2019. So they say, Amber and I sat at a small round table across from the most prolific abortionist in the history of the state of Indiana, who still comes to his closed-down clinic once a week and spends the night in the basement. He hasn't been allowed to perform abortions in this building since the end of 2013, yet here he is. I looked around the room, my heart sinking inside me as I thought of the nonchalant conversations that must have taken place in this very room between the nurse executioners and the clinic escorts as they wolfed down their lunches, complaining about politics and spouses and talking about their weekend plans, all the while baby after baby, safe and warm inside their mother's womb, is being unwittingly led down the hallway to be executed and their bodies discarded in a red medical waste bag. If we only knew. If they only knew back then. Their only crime being conceived and being an inconvenience before they can even cry out for help. Mark continues. As he ran his hands through his gray tousled hair, George looked over his smudged glasses at us both. And George starts telling his story. In 1945, George says, I was with my aunt in the suburbs of Dresden. In February of 1945, in between the Americans and the English, they firebombed Dresden for 3 days and 2 nights. The death toll varies upon who you want to believe. The Allies say it was 40 or 50,000. The Germans said somewhere around 100,000. The German government at that time said it was 150,000. American POWs who were in trains at the train station got killed by the bombings. In 1945, 1946, 1947, when the Russians were where we lived at the time, the Russian soldiers were driving through the fields with their AK-47s, shooting at anything and everything. The house across the street from us was destroyed in the bombing. The Dresden bombing, but another bombing, and most of that family got killed. So the effects of the war may have probably not have had a positive effect, ... on my perception. Okay? That's what George says. George Clocker. He... On your perception of what? Mark interrupts. George stopped for a moment, then looked at us both. George says, of human beings, what they do to each other. And in that moment, Mark says, I don't think there could have been anything more ironic and tragic at the same time. The abortionist himself was responsible for conceivably 10,000 lives, talking about how World War II changed his perception of what people can do to each other. And I wondered to myself if this man even hears himself when he talks. He started to describe his early years in practice in Chicago and the first abortion he ever performed with a long sigh. George started in with his twisted tale of self-justification. George says, quote, when I was at the hospital in Evanston, I was a 12-year. I had a 12-year-old girl that was raped by her uncle. She was 21 weeks pregnant, and I had to do the abortion in the hospital. Okay, that didn't bother me. What bothered me is that her dad and mother wouldn't prosecute the uncle for raping their daughter. End quote. George then went on to talk about how forcing a woman or young girl, in this case, who has been raped to have the child, if she chooses not to, is wrong. Wow, there's a lot to analyze there. It took us some time after our meeting to fully process everything he said. First, here he is admitting that his very first in utero murder was a 21-week-old baby. Later in the conversation, directly contradicting himself, he would insist that he never performed abortions past the first trimester. By his own admission, that first abortion on a 21-week-old baby wasn't what bothered him at all. Aborting a 21-week-old baby is not scraping some clump of cells out of a woman's uterus. A 21-week-old baby in the womb has eyes, fingers, toes, ears, a heartbeat, brain waves, and can survive outside of the womb. So the very first time George did this, he reached inside of a 12-year-old girl with surgical instruments. And this is where, when I read this, it was very much like my vision again that the Lord gave me. And I had no idea. So the first time George did this, he reached inside a 12-year-old girl with surgical instruments, ripped that baby's arms and legs off, probably beheaded it after puncturing the baby's skull and letting the brain and its fluids drain out. And then threw the baby's dismembered corpse into the biohazard waste bin to be thrown out with the rest of the surgical garbage. And that is not what bothered him. What bothered him, he says, is that the girl's parents protected the child molester, who happened to be the girl's uncle, by not reporting the crime. There are so many tragedies in this story that it's hard to know where to start, Mark writes. First, a 12-year-old girl who is molested and impregnated by a family member is a terrible and unthinkable crime. That young girl, who would now be a grown woman, close to 60, has been living with that trauma her entire life. She has also been living with that regret of having lost her first and maybe only child at the hands of a man who went on to murder, again, thousands of times over. What is so shocking and ironic in this part of his tale is that George sent 3 girls that we know of back into the exact same situations. He did exactly the same thing to not 1, not 2, but to 3 young girls. All 13 years of age. Performing abortions on these 13-year-olds, then sending them right back into that same situation that got them pregnant in the first place without reporting it to Child Protective Services. In Indiana, abortionists are required to report to CPS any procedures done to any girl under the age of 14, as there is quite likely a child molester involved. George purposely did not report the underage girl situations to the authorities, who likely would have stopped further abuse. In fact, it was this non-reporting that, once discovered, quickly unraveled his abortion practice and eventually resulted in his license being permanently suspended in the state of Indiana. So this very thing that he described seeing happen to a 12-year-old girl in Illinois in 1974 that supposedly made him so angry at the injustice of it all, where a young girl was raped by her uncle, then sent back with no legal repercussions for the rapist, is exactly the thing that George himself facilitated 3 times. No, George didn't perpetrate the rapes. He just took care of that whole pregnancy thing. Then covered up the crime by not telling anyone about it who could go after the perpetrators. In fact, the 14-year-old girl in Fort Wayne, whose abortion George purposely did not report to the authorities until months later, her mother subsequently did report the situation to the police, and the girl's 19-year-old assailant was arrested and charged with 2 counts of child molestation. I couldn't stop myself. I had to call him out, Mark says. You did exactly the same thing to those 3 girls, George. Do you think maybe those girls got sent back into that situation? George paused and thought. And George said, I honestly can't tell you. I don't know what the state does when a girl underage gets raped and has an abortion. What the state does, okay, I don't know. That's a scary... He actually said that. He doesn't know what the state does. Well, the state can't do anything if he doesn't report it, right? So Mark goes on and he says, I pressed him on it again. But you just sat here and told us this tragic story about how the 12-year-old girl in Chicago got sent right back into that abusive situation because her parents refused to report it to the authorities, and that it made you so mad. Here, you had the opportunity, the legal obligation, to report these girls' situations so that the perpetrators could be caught, and you didn't. It's the same thing, Mark says to George. And George's answer was simple. George says, it's not the same. And that, Mark says, was all the more answer we got out of George on that matter. And that pretty much is the end of part 3. Now, we are not reading the every piece of the blog. We're just getting the meat of it. If you want to read all the blog series of Interview with the Abortionist by Mark and Amber Archer, the links will be in the description of this video of everything we've read. And so with that, we're going to move on to the final part of the Interview with the Abortionist by Mark and Amber Archer. I need to take a break. I need a moment. Jeremy, I want you to
You need me to discuss.
I want you to. I need a break for a moment because I'm really struggling.
Here.
I've got water, but I want you to share your thoughts so far on what I just read, because you have not read any of this. This is all new to you. Now, I have read this 3 times since Monday.
And I intentionally decided to not read this so I'd have a live reaction during the show. Something I don't normally do. But in the meantime, as I said at the beginning of this program, I've been scrolling through topics. Abortion. Mark Archer. The abortionist name. And this is blown up all over the place. There's other people sharing this post too, but this one isn't going to blow up as much until the movie comes out next year. If you watched the Glenn Beck special,
well, it wasn't a special. It was just his radio show.
Well, his radio show.
They did like a 25. I didn't even know they were going to be on.
Yeah, we didn't even pay attention.
You were getting ready for work. I was watching the show, and I had no idea they were going to be on the show. I had no idea. And he just says, we're going to have this couple on via the telephone to talk about their documentary. And I started listening. I was like, holy crap. Oh my gosh. So, everybody needs to know about this couple and what they've been doing, what they've exposed before all of this came out.
So if you're wanting a break,
yeah, I need it.
Just don't interject again.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Give yourself some space because you need a moment to be able to finish this. I told you this would be like a 2-hour special. Told her this before we started. It could be 3 if I share all of the other stuff I have. And I know people will be watching this later and not live, and I'm hoping everything's going fine. Everything I've checked looks like it's fine. But to get back to on topic, we've heard about communism, socialism, Nazism, serial killer, murderer. These topics continually come up throughout the study about abortion. The other topic is population control that you hear. And as you learn more and more about different people, it goes right back to what I said. Somebody let the standard. This is me trying to be the devil's advocate right now and say the least thing I could possibly say first. Somebody let the standard slide to allow him to facilitate as long as he did. Number 2. Why didn't anyone else speak up? Fellow employees. I mean, how do you put something in your car and not anybody not see that? I mean, would not anybody notice that?
2,411 dead babies that they know of so far. So, I have no idea how you do that.
It goes back, and this enlightens and strengthens those in the pro-life movement. You cannot say it won't. You cannot blink in a bat of your eye for those of you that are pro-choice and not say, if this is going to happen in one state, this horrific, somebody else could repeat this again somewhere else. And history shows that when people preserve dead bodies, the word torture normally gets brought up. Was someone else abused that wasn't a baby by this person? Or were babies abused beyond the legal standard practice of abortion? That's a possibility here. And something that no one will ever know the answer to. And the fact that this man was open enough to bring up, I'll see Hitler in heaven.
Well, we haven't even got
to that part.
This is in part 4.
You're about to hear this, and that's why I said, you want my reaction now? I'm going to go ahead and throw it all out there. There are liberals that will say conservatives are Nazis. There are conservatives that say liberals are Nazis. If you've studied the socialist and communist historical history, they say completely in 2019 on the website, we have people in all parties. They want to infiltrate everything.
The extremists on the left and the extremists on the right, they are the same people.
They found a way to take their extreme left views and make it an extreme right view. They just...
The extreme right and the extreme left have the same end result. Yes. People die.
Mm-hmm. And without proper standard, without proper people doing the right thing, this will not stop. And as we can see right now, and Miranda's got to think about this, a lot of these clinics have closed, but people like him may still have their own tools at their house and will start doing things on the side. This is where liberals are going to talk about, you know, the coat hangers and all that other stuff from the 60s and 70s and 80s that happened. Unfortunately, banning complete abortion is going to cause someone to be ridiculous enough to mutilate themselves to get rid of a baby.
People are mutilating themselves and killing their babies, even now.
And we got people involved
with abortion laws, you know.
And we got people involved in all sorts of crazy things. And it's not just the crazy people that are like involved in doing extreme torture and all that other stuff. When somebody has a mental breakdown, a gun will show up somewhere, or a knife, or they'll harm themselves. And especially if it was rape or something like that, or incest or over there, people will just lose it. So there's an underlying piece here of mental health. You train somebody to understand what happens if you have sex. There's more things out there that exist that can keep you from having to get to this abortion step. And according to technology, we won't really need an abortion in the future. We're talking 100, 150 years now, because technology will have another version of Plan B. Or they'll call it Plan F at that point, probably. There are people talking about, well, let's just sterilize our children when they're born, and they just never have children. So it doesn't matter what they do. There's countries doing that now.
And they're communist, socialist countries.
And that's the thing. They are communist and socialist countries, and it's a population control. It's a, well, I'm trying to take care of the least of these, and there's one country that just celebrated.
Use any excuse to justify.
Another thing that's connected to this, another country just said they celebrated, they don't have any more children that have Down syndrome.
Iceland.
That's Iceland.
It was Iceland.
And they connected it to abortion.
Yeah. There's no children with Down syndrome because they abort them before they can ever draw breath. They didn't cure a disease, they killed children.
So instead of finding a way to augment a person's DNA so you don't have that type of a child, or once you find out they are going to be out that way, come up with a cure to fix the child in the womb. No, let's just get rid of it. So then that's going to be the future.
They call it a cure.
Which goes back to the T4 program that the Nazis were using. Let's just get rid of all the weakest people. And they were looking at master races, and they went, and everyone wants us to quote about the white version. They were looking at everybody's version and how to manipulate the whole schematic.
It's called eugenics. Mm-hmm. And it started in America. Did you know that? Eugenics started in America, and that's how the Nazis learned it.
Right now, here in America, we have people saying if you're too sick, you can end your life. And
they're passing laws to do that.
They're passing laws. And as long as we allow these laws to continue, as long as you allow things to not change, people be held accountable, something like this is going to become mainstream. When you're having Democrats not blink an eye and say this is okay.
They can kill a baby even after it's born. They can choose whether to let it live or die.
What are we doing? What example are we setting here? That's what I got to ask you today. What are we doing with ourselves?
All right, are you done?
Back to you.
All right. Oh, I needed to
over.
I needed a drink and
transition over. You're not on screen.
And to compose myself a moment. And because the fourth part of their interview is really the hardest to read. So here we go. Part 4 interview with the abortionist by Mark and Amber Archer. And this blog was posted March 18, 2019. George was starting to get agitated with us both. We both sat and let him talk for a good 25 minutes straight, only interrupting him from time to time to ask questions for clarification. We hadn't yet really started to debate him on things that really wasn't our intent. Our intent when we came in was to try to understand his story and background, then ask him tough questions in a fair but direct manner. It didn't take long, though, before we both started interrupting him regularly to challenge him on his divergence from reality, trying to justify his argument that life only begins when a baby can be born and survive on his or her own outside the mother's womb. George strolled right into the line of fire from Amber. Life does not begin at conception. A fertilized egg in a test tube, ... is not a life. It's a fertilized egg in a test tube, George says. Amber slapped the table and leaned in and looked at George and said, "My body is not a test tube." George recoiled and collected himself and says, "I understand that, but you're saying life begins at conception, and if I take an egg and I put it in a test tube and I put sperm and the sperm has fertilized the egg, it's not alive." Oh, George slapped the table as he raised his voice even further. Amber came right back at him and said, "You know as a doctor that women's bodies are designed that way to carry these children. To let the fertilized egg develop in your uterus to become a fetus, to become a child." I was still watching in amazement as my beautiful bride not only faced off with George, but fired right back at him in rapid succession. I honestly don't think he had any idea what to make of her. He retorted once more and said, "And to become a child, but the point is, until the fetus is old enough to be viable outside of the womb and become a child, until that point, it's not alive." Amber stared him down for a moment. "But how did you come to that conclusion?" she asked. "You know, that inside the mother's body, inside the womb, that it's a baby." George replied indignantly, "No, it's a fetus." A pause. In that moment, I pondered the gravity of what I had just heard. I came into this conversation expecting a discussion of logic, and instead, what I was hearing was a game of semantics. This is a very, very important word. Semantics. It's very simple. Change the words, call it something else, redefine the terminology. It's not a baby, it's a fetus. There. Now, we can feel better about removing that unwanted growth, that fetus, and move on with our lives. See how easy that was. But Amber didn't come in to debate semantics. She came in to share the gospel with George. She looked straight at him and, quote, Amber said, "The Lord is so forgiving to all of us." George was indifferent and said, "And when we get to heaven and we see Joseph Stalin, Uncle Adolf Hitler, and Mussolini." Amber interrupted him. "Well, I doubt that they'll be there." And George said, "You're making a judgment. The Lord is forgiving." George laughed and looked over at me. I leaned back in my chair to avoid being struck by lightning, as this man openly mocked God. Amber didn't let up on him. "That's right, the Lord is forgiving to those who call on him." George hadn't budged even a millimeter in this conversation. "And the bottom line is, we all make a choice in this life. Whether it's the right choice or the wrong choice, we don't know," George says. Amber interrupted him. "Have you asked for forgiveness for killing children?" George interrupted right back. "No, because I didn't kill children. No, your conception and my conception of when life begins is different. Life does not begin at conception." Whew. Right, he didn't kill children. He removed unwanted fetuses. And that is all there is to justification in the mind of an abortionist to taking the life of a child in the womb. In George's mind, it is settled fact. that life only begins when the baby is born, or when it is able to survive outside the womb on its own, or at 24 weeks, or was it 20? But that answer depends upon which time period of justification we're talking about, because it has shifted. And therein lies the problem, Mark says. The shifting sands of the argument. The abortionist, just the same as any other humanist, lives by a set of non-specific, ever-shifting non-absolutes. Whenever the equation comes out to an answer they don't like, they simply plug new variables into the equation until they achieve the outcome they desire. The biggest problem with this is that it forces one to completely detach from all absolutes, which is what George did a long time ago. From denial of God to a denial of God's absolutes, to a denial of science and a denial of reality. There is no way to argue with a man whose absolutes don't exist. As we wrapped up our conversation with George that morning, Mark says, he shook our hands and showed us to the door, even walking outside to our car. If it weren't for the fact that we had just been debating his justification for being an abortionist for 40 years, I would almost have said it was a pleasant ending to a strange and strained conversation. I couldn't help but wonder just what he was feeling after having been challenged for over an hour. We later confirmed George's age to see if he could indeed have lived through the Dresden bombings. It checks out, Mark says. And I think that makes me the most sad for him. Maybe it's lifelong symptoms of PTSD. Maybe he had a terrible home life. Whatever it was, or maybe a combination of things. It made that young boy grow up to be a man who had a big dead spot inside. Unable to see the Lord's creation for what it truly is, he sank further and further into a world that destroyed his soul and never let him out of its grasp. And for that young boy, I feel empathy, Mark says. As we told people over the next few days and weeks about our conversation with George, we repeated one thing above all else. We've asked people to please pray for George and others like him. I am grateful that he has been stopped from his awful practice, but I hurt for the man who has been destroyed by the murderous work he's done his entire life. What hope is there for an abortionist who has been abandoned by all, no longer useful to the abortion industry? Why would they even have anything else to do with him? I pondered for weeks after our meeting why on earth George would still come every week to his clinic, only to turn around the next morning to go home again. There are many possibilities I've envisioned, but one thing is for certain: he is lonely. We could tell that just by how much he was willing to talk with us. And loneliness is something that I certainly can understand. So I pray even more for George, that one day he would remember that the Lord is forgiving, even to a repentant abortionist. Jesus himself said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." Mark chapter 2, verse 17. And that, my friends, family, fellow Christians, is the end of the 4-part blog series, Interview with the Abortionist by Mark and Amber Archer. I thank you for watching. But what do we do with this?
We got one more.
We know we know what this man has done in the past, and now we're finding out even more what this man has done since he has died just a couple months ago.
Are you ready for
this?
I
think the most important thing that Mark said in this whole thing is he wasn't mad at him. He was sad for him because he was so deranged, delusional about everything, and he was truly lost. And after all that, he said, "I asked you to pray for him and others like him." And it goes back to the vision. What do we do with this? How can we affect change? How can we stop these people? How can we effectively change the way our society is going? And it's straight to hell in a handbasket. And it goes back to number one. And every part of that I talked about. I said majority of the time, intercessory prayer. Prayer. Number 1 starts with prayer. Number 2 starts with prayer. Number 3 starts with prayer. Number 4, boldly speak. Number 5, vote. Do you want somebody like Pete Buttigieg, who is standing there, who is the mayor over this city that is doing this investigation now? Is he the mayor, or is he's the mayor? Do you want Pete Buttigieg, he's making excuses that, oh, well, yeah, okay, Crawford did this, but, we don't need to stop abortion. Everything's okay. We need to be bold, but we need to be bold in love and in kindness. We do not need to be like these protesters that are on the streets, harassing people, throwing things, assaulting, sometimes trying to kill people to get their point across. This is not how we do it. This is not the right way. That is how the communists and the fascists and the anarchists and the crazy people do it. We are not crazy. And we need to stand up through love as Jesus did. And Jesus took stands many times against the things that were going on in society of the time. And he did it without physically harming or sinning. He never sinned when he stood up and took a stand against something. And that is one of the most important things we need to remember. Do as Christ did. But the other thing we must do is remember, I always go back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German minister who was executed by the Nazis during World War II for working in the underground against the Nazis. He said during the whole World War II Nazi, overtake, he said, not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. If you are sitting there and you do nothing with what you have just heard, what you have just read, then you are acting. You are speaking if you don't do anything with any of this. This is like over 30 pages of documented proof of what this guy has done. And we see that it has happened before. It's documented with Kermit Gosnell. He's sitting in prison for the rest of his life because he did things exactly like Hoffler did. This needs to stop. And the only way it will stop is good, moral people. Don't even have to be Christian. I'm not saying Christian people, but good, moral people stand up for what is right. And take a stand. So, I want to share, so while we were preparing for this show, just this week, California just passed a new bill that they hope to be law. And it is a new mandate for all public colleges in the state of California. And I'm going to let Jeremy read this right now.
To summarize this up, it's Senate Bill 24. It's the College Student Right to Access Act. All the 34 colleges and universities have until January 2023 to comply. It's 2 pills, and Gavin Newsom is excited about it. He's says as other states and the federal government go backward, restricting reproductive freedom, in California, we're moving forward, expanding access and reaffirming a woman's right to choose. We're removing barriers to reproductive health, increasing access on college campuses, using technology to modernize how patients interact with providers. So,
you're making it easier to get an abortion pill than they are to get birth control.
And there's a study they used out of the journal Adolescent Health. 62% of students there were more than 30 minutes away from an abortion facility, and they also said the cost was $604. So they're saying it costs a lot more money.
So the college got to foot the bill, right?
Now, the one thing I want to sit here and interject before I finish that.
Is that what it appears that they're going to do? They're making it
they're wanting to do this so then students, can have access to it quickly because research shows
and more affordably.
More affordably. I don't know if there's a price if you go to the college to pick up the pill.
They're not saying that, are they?
Whether there is or not. They're saying as states across our country are rolling back women's health care and access to abortion, California continues to lead the nation protecting every individual's right to choose. By ensuring that abortion care is available on campus, college students will not have to choose between delaying important medical care or needing to travel long distances or even missing classes at work. So my next question is, I'm like, so you got this morning after pill thing, okay, you got this other thing, these 2 pills. When I was in the military, they were talking about creating a pill, like a birth control pill for men.
Yeah.
That's still in the works. They're talking about creating other pills and all sorts of different things. And they're trying to get away from like IUD devices. They're trying to get away from shots and things like that. So as technology advances, there'll be even something more in the next few years that'll happen. And it's kind of weird for me, though, that they have chosen to only talk about abortion.
Yeah.
And they want to say you give a right for a woman to choose, but I'm like, the only choice you're giving me is keep the baby or don't have the baby. You're not doing a push on helping the adoption epidemic, which that needs fixed. You're not, trying to teach people to make good choices and who they have sex with as much. You're just saying, here's all this stuff, do whatever you're going to do. Because they're saying, well, you've tried that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on and so forth. They're saying, well, if we start, inundating society with all this sex, then people don't want to have sex anymore. Just like they're doing with the drinking and smoking. Well, what just happened here in Ohio? They raised the limit to smoking to 21.
Yet, you can go have an abortion when you're a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
You can't buy cigarettes in Ohio if you're 18 years old, but you can have an abortion even when you're underage.
So I'm confused.
Makes sense?
As to why are we doing these mannerisms? Why are we functioning in such a way that we cannot?
Because people want to justify their sins.
But okay, I understand you're wanting to justify your sin. But if you're going to use terminology that a woman has a right
semantics,
to choose,
that's the key word. Semantics. Not language, it's semantics.
Or for man, see, because like when it says a woman's right to choose, if you're talking about having heterosexual sex, man and woman, the only dialogue in today's society is the woman chooses. Don't I have to decide?
No, men do not have a choice.
Wait a minute. Okay. Here we go. My hand is going to come into the picture. Now, wait a minute. Put your hand down. Not yet. You know what I'm about to do. Now, my hand is symbolizing that sexual intercourse occurred. Now, it's a woman's choice to tell me to do this, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But I have to choose to do the interaction with the woman for it to happen.
Mm-hmm. But after that,
if it's not an in vitro fertilization, there's still a man's right to choose. So we still, while society needs to empower women, I understand that. In this society,
men have no rights.
In the next echelon of a cultural society shift, it should be the man and woman's right to choose.
The crazy thing is,
they're not saying that either.
The woman can choose not to have the baby, and you have no say. But if she keeps the baby, then you're responsible for it, and you got to pay child support. And you got to support this kid until it's 18 years old.
And that's the other thing. That is the crazy logic. A man has to pay more in child support than a woman. It's not always based on how much you make.
It should be.
In some cases, some people would argue, saying that's not how it goes. The rules have changed where it's better, but still a lot of times men get the biggest hit.
I agree with that.
So that's a problem. It's a big problem.
All right, so we've gone nearly 2 hours.
We've covered a lot, and like I said, I've been scrolling on my phone this whole time.
Guys, I'm tired.
I could go another hour on stuff that I have found on this topic alone.
Yeah. So
to summarize,
I'm exhausted.
What we have to do as Christians, for those that are watching that are Christians that made it to this point, you got to do more than just pray. You got to understand.
And more than just watch what we just shared. You need to share what we have shared. Mm-hmm. You need to print up these interviews and this interview. You need to print up. You need to share news stories. You need to get bring to light what has been hiding in the darkness all this time, and be bold and do it in love. And I think that's the way to end this tonight. And pray for us.
Say a prayer real quick.
I can't pray. I can't. Okay. I'm done. I'm so
we gotta pray.
Exhausted.
We can't be done. We have to pray. You
start. You pray. No, you do it.
Okay.
Please.
All right. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you now and we just ask that you guide children, teenagers, adults, us, leaders, young and old, to assist those that are struggling with money and health and wisdom of decisions that they're making in their lives. Abortion is not an easy choice. Keeping a baby is not an easy choice. And as society currently is removing versions of Planned Parenthood centers and so on and so forth, removing from America and elsewhere, there's other countries that are expanding this capability. And I've met some people that have made these decisions and they're still happy 20 years later, and others are completely repentant and depressed that they made that choice. And we just ask that you wrap your arms around everyone who's involved in this, from those that are in the medical community, because knowing, like my ex-girlfriend, she was trying to go to school and that was one of the facilities she had to choose from for training. And she had to quit because she couldn't handle what she saw. So we ask you, Lord Jesus, to just not only just love on people, but show people a way out. There's someone right now that wants to get out of the industry of abortion, but still stay in the medical community, but is afraid of what happened with Abby Johnson and others. There's people that are wanting to pass laws against this, but they're afraid to stand up. May these stories be able to assist. May this movie be able to assist people in making the right decisions. Because while some places may not get rid of abortion, you can still work in that facility. People can still get saved in an abortion clinic. People can still get saved after they've had an abortion or while they're making the decision. And if they're already saved and they're just making a bad choice, you can still help them. Because there's people that have committed suicide after this. There's people in the community that have looked down upon them for making that decision. There's others that are excitedly ecstatic for the decisions that they have made for being pro-choice and not pro-life. And we ask you, Lord Jesus, to just direct your angels to assist in all the directions that need to be done. In your name we pray, amen.
All right, guys. We will see you Monday, October 21st, 2019, 8 p.m. right here at jmclive.com. We're going to do our JMC Live show for the month, and then we will rebroadcast this show live right after our regular JMC Live show. So, God bless you, and continue working together to fulfill the Great Commission. That is our goal in our ministry. Working together to fulfill the Great Commission. Good night, and God bless.